Clint Eastwood sat back in his chair, the warm California sun casting long shadows across his patio. At 94, the Hollywood legend had seen it all, good, bad, and everything in between. He had built a career on playing tough, no-nonsense characters, and in real life he wasn't much different. So, when an ambitious young reporter from a progressive news outlet set out to challenge him, he was more amused than irritated. The interview was meant to be a feature piece on his storied career, but it quickly became clear that the reporter had other intentions. The young man, barely in his 30s, sat across from Clint, adjusting his glasses and flipping through his notes with a smug confidence. "Mr. Eastwood," he began, his voice carrying the condescending tone of someone who had already made up his mind. "You've been criticized for being politically incorrect, even outdated. Many say your views belong to a different time. How do you respond to those who believe you're out of touch with modern society?" Clint chuckled, his gravelly voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Outdated? Kid, I've been around long enough to know that every generation thinks they've reinvented the wheel. They never have." The reporter's lips pressed into a thin line, clearly unsatisfied with the answer. "But don't you think Hollywood has moved past the kind of masculinity you represented? The era of the lone, gun-slinging cowboy, the tough guy who doesn't talk about his feelings. Doesn't that reinforce toxic stereotypes?" Clint leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to make the young man shift uncomfortably. "You know what's really toxic?" he asked. "People who think toughness is a flaw. The world isn't always a nice place. Sometimes you've got to stand your ground, fight for what's right. You think that's outdated?" The reporter fumbled for a response, but Clint wasn't finished. He rested his weathered hands on the table and continued. "I made movies about tough guys, sure, but they weren't bullies. They had a code. They fought for justice. And if people think that's a bad thing now, well, that says more about them than it does about me." The young journalist sighed, clearly intent on steering the conversation toward controversy. "You've also been accused of being politically conservative, and some say that's why your films glorify a certain ideology. Do you think your movies have contributed to the divisiveness in America today?" Clint let out a dry chuckle. "You give me too much credit, kid. A movie doesn't divide a nation. People do. If you want to be offended by something, you'll find a way. That's the world we live in now. Folks spend more time being outraged than getting things done." The reporter, sensing he was losing ground, tried one last angle. "Do you regret anything you've said or done in your career, given how much social values have changed?" Clint's expression didn't waver. "Regret? No. I've always spoken my mind, and I always will. The problem today is too many people are afraid to say what they really think. They tiptoe around everything, worried someone might get upset. You know what happens when you live like that? You stop being honest. And if you can't be honest, what's the point?" The silence stretched between them as the reporter realized he had been outmatched. He had come in expecting to expose an old man's so-called outdated beliefs. But instead, he had been given a lesson in conviction, in resilience, in the kind of integrity that didn't bend with the winds of popular opinion. Clint took a sip of his coffee, the conversation already forgotten in his mind. To him, this was just another day, another debate, but for the young journalist, the moment lingered. He had come to humiliate a legend and had left feeling humiliated himself. As the interview wrapped up, the reporter shifted in his seat, clearly rattled. He had come prepared with a set of questions meant to corner Clint Eastwood, to paint him as a relic of a bygone era, but instead, he found himself facing a man who was unshaken, unimpressed, and most of all, unafraid. Clint leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "Anything else, kid?" The reporter hesitated. He had expected an easy victory, a few sensational quotes he could twist into an article about how the Hollywood legend was out of touch. Instead, he had been hit with the raw, unapologetic truth. Finally, he sighed. "No, I think I have what I need." Clint smirked. "Good. Hope you write something honest, but I won't hold my breath." The young man avoided Clint's gaze as he gathered his things. There was a tension in the air, not anger, but something deeper. A realization. Clint Eastwood wasn't just some aging star clinging to the past. He was a man who had lived through wars, cultural shifts, political upheavals, and still stood firm. While others changed their beliefs to fit the times, he had remained true to himself. As the reporter stood up, Clint added one final thought. You know, kid, the real problem isn't me. It's that people like you think standing for something is a crime. You see conviction and you call it outdated. But let me tell you something, principles don't expire. The words hit hard. The young journalist paused, then gave a weak nod before walking away. As Clint watched him go, he chuckled to himself. He had faced tougher opponents, in movies and in life. This wasn't a fight, it was just another example of how the world had changed. People had become too soft, too quick to label strength as a flaw, too eager to tear down anyone who refused to conform. But Clint didn't care. He never had. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, he picked up his coffee again, took a long sip, and smiled. Some things never change. Clint sat in silence for a moment, enjoying the evening air as the young reporter walked away, his shoulders slightly hunched, his confidence visibly shaken. The kid would probably go back to his editor, try to spin the conversation into some kind of hit piece. But Clint had been through this dance too many times to care. The truth was simple. He had nothing to prove. He had made his mark on Hollywood, on American culture, on storytelling itself. He had survived in an industry that chewed up and spit out men half his age. He had directed and starred in films that would outlive the fleeting outrage of the day. And most of all, he had lived life on his own terms, never asking permission to be who he was. A slight breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby oak trees as Clint stood up and stretched. His old bones ached, but he liked that. It meant he was still here, still standing. He walked inside, the sound of his boots echoing against the hardwood floors. He made his way to his study where old scripts, awards, and framed photos lined the walls. There was one in particular he liked, an old black and white shot from the set of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He and Lee Van Cleef stood side by side, squinting into the sun, dust clinging to their boots, hands hovering over their revolvers. Clint smirked. Those days were long gone, but the spirit of them, the grit, the independence, that was what Hollywood had lost. That was what people like that reporter couldn't understand. The world didn't need more censors, more moral lectures, more actors playing the role of activists. It needed stories that mattered, characters with depth, heroes who stood for something. He picked up the script he had been reading earlier, his next project. He wasn't done yet. They could call him outdated, out of touch, irrelevant. It didn't matter. He had one last film in him, and if he was going out, he was going out on his own terms. Clint Eastwood wasn't riding into the sunset just yet. A faint smile crossed Clint's face as he flipped through the pages of the script. It had the makings of something real, something raw, stripped of the artificial gloss that modern Hollywood seemed to love so much. No forced messages, no pandering, just a damn good story. That was all that ever mattered. He walked over to the window, watching as the last golden rays of sunlight stretched across the California hills. The world outside had changed in ways he sometimes barely recognized, but he had learned long ago that trying to fight the tide was a waste of time. Better to stand firm, let the waves crash, and remain unmoved. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his moment of reflection. He glanced down at the screen. It was an old friend, a fellow director who had managed to survive the industry's constant reinvention alongside him. With a slow chuckle, Clint answered, "Heard you had a run-in with one of those young bloods." The voice on the other end said, "Saw him sulking in the studio parking lot." Clint smirked. "Yeah, kid came looking for a headline, left with a history lesson." The friend laughed. "Bet he wasn't ready for that." "They never are," Clint said. "They think they know everything. But experience, real life, that's something you can't Google." There was a pause before the friend spoke again. "So, what's next for you?" Clint leaned against the desk, looking down at the script in his hands. His fingers traced the edges of the pages, the weight of the words sinking in. "One more film," he said. Maybe my last. Maybe not. Either way, it'll be a damn good one. Figured you weren't. Done yet, the friend replied. Keep proving them wrong. Clint smiled. Not proving anything, just telling a story. As he hung up the phone, he felt something familiar stir inside him. That fire, that unshakable drive that had carried him through decades in an industry that never made it easy. He wasn't here to fit in. He wasn't here to apologize. He was here to create, to do what he did best. The critics, the reporters, the so-called cultural gatekeepers. They would keep talking, keep trying to tear down what they didn't understand. But at the end of the day, they'd be forgotten. And Clint Eastwood, he'd still be standing. Clint set the script down and walked over to the small bar in the corner of his study. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, the rich amber liquid swirling in the glass as he took a slow sip. The warmth spread through his chest, a familiar comfort much like the quiet of the evening around him. He thought back to the reporter, so sure of himself, so eager to challenge a man who had lived through more than he could ever imagine. It wasn't the first time Clint had dealt with people like him, and it wouldn't be the last. Every few years, some young journalist with an agenda came along, thinking they'd be the one to finally expose him, to break him down, to make him admit that he was on the wrong side of history. But Clint had never cared about sides. He had never been interested in playing by the rules of cultural trends. He just did the work, made the movies he wanted to make, said what he meant and meant what he said. And for better or worse, that had made him who he was. The bourbon burned, slightly as he took another sip, staring at the collection of framed photographs on the wall. There was one of him and Sergio Leone, taken on the set of A Fistful of Dollars, another of him directing Unforgiven, a reminder of the film that had cemented his legacy as more than just an actor. He had always been evolving, adapting, pushing forward. Yet, no matter how much he changed, one thing remained constant: his refusal to bow to the nonsense. The phone buzzed again, this time with a notification. Clint rarely paid much attention to the online world, but he had a feeling he knew what it was about. With a sigh, he picked up the phone and scrolled through the headlines. Sure enough, there it was. The reporter had already published his article. The headline was predictable. Clint Eastwood doubles down on outdated views in fiery interview. Clint let out a low chuckle. Doubles down, he muttered. Hell, I never backed down in the first place. He skimmed through the piece. The reporter had done his best to paint Clint as an old man stuck in his ways, clinging to a past that no longer existed. But even with the obvious bias, the real message shone through. The comments section was filled with people calling out the reporter, defending Clint, praising his unwillingness to conform. Some even mocked the journalist for trying to take down a living legend and failing miserably. Clint smirked. The reporter had walked in thinking he'd make a fool out of him. Instead, he had embarrassed himself. Finishing his bourbon, Clint set the glass down and turned back to his script. The world could say whatever it wanted. He had work to do. He grabbed a pen and made a few notes in the margins. A scene needed tightening. A line needed sharpening. The next morning, Clint rose early, just as he always had. His routine never changed. Strong coffee, a long walk, and then straight to work. He wasn't the type to dwell on yesterday, and he certainly wasn't about to waste time worrying about what some journalist thought of him. As he stepped outside, the crisp morning air greeted him. The world was quiet, except for the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of waves crashing against the California coastline. Clint took a deep breath, stretching out his old bones before heading down the familiar dirt path that wound through his property. His mind drifted back to the script. It was shaping up into something special, something that felt real. He had one more story left to tell, and he wasn't going to let Hollywood's current climate water it down. By the time he returned to the house, his assistant was already waiting, with a stack of papers and a few phone messages. "Morning, Mr. Eastwood," she said, glancing up from her tablet. "Looks like your interview stirred up some headlines." Clint grunted as he poured himself another cup of coffee. "Imagine that," she smirked. "Mostly the usual nonsense, but the public's on your side as always. That reporter's getting roasted online. Clint took a sip of his coffee, unfazed. Kid'll learn a lesson one way or another. She nodded, scrolling through her notes. Also, the studio called. They're still eager to move forward with your next film. They're just wondering if you'd consider softening a few parts. Clint looked up, his blue eyes sharp. Softening? She hesitated. They're worried about, the tone. They think certain parts might be a little too strong. Clint let out a dry chuckle. I tell stories, not bedtime fairy tales. I figured you'd say that, she said with a grin. So I told them you'd pass if they tried to mess with it. Clint gave her an approving nod. Good. He knew how this game worked. The studios always got nervous when a filmmaker refused to cater to the latest social trends. But Clint had been making movies long before these executives were even born. He wasn't about to start apologizing for doing things his way. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an old friend in the industry. Saw the interview. Damn good answers. Hollywood could use more guys like you. Clint smirked and set the phone down. He didn't need validation, but it was always nice to know that there were still a few people left in the business who understood. He walked back to his desk and picked up the script once more. The world could keep spinning, the headlines could keep coming, and the critics could keep talking. But Clint Eastwood, he had a movie to make, and nothing was going to stop him. Clint spent the next few hours buried in his work, marking up the script, tweaking dialogue, and making notes for his production team. He had always believed in precision. Every word, every scene, every moment had to serve the story. He wasn't about to let anyone dilute his vision. By midday, he leaned back, in his chair, rubbing his temples. The work was rewarding, but damn if it didn't take a toll. At 94, he still had the fire, but even he had to admit that the years weren't as forgiving as they once were. His assistant knocked gently on the door and stepped inside. Sorry to bother you, Mr. Eastwood, but Warner Brothers just called. Again. They really want to talk. Clint sighed, setting down his pen. Let them through. A moment later, his speakerphone crackled to life. Clint, good to hear your voice, came the smooth but slightly nervous tone of a studio executive. Look, we all respect your work, but after yesterday's interview, there's been a bit of, concern. Some higher-ups are wondering if this is the right time for a film like yours. Clint rolled his eyes. He had heard this before. What's the problem now? Well, the exec hesitated. The film's tone, the characters. Some feel that the themes might be too divisive. We're just wondering if you'd consider adjusting a few elements, making it a little more contemporary, Clint scoffed. Contemporary? You mean sanitized? No, of course not, the executive backpedaled. Just a little more in line with modern audiences. Clint leaned forward, his voice turning ice cold. Listen, kid, if I wanted to make a movie that pleased everyone, I'd be directing commercials. I tell real stories about real people. If that's too much for you, find someone else. The line went silent for a moment before the exec spoke again, his voice more careful this time. Clint, we want this film. We really do. It's just, then, let me make it, Clint cut in. No compromises. No rewrites to fit whatever's trending this week. I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. I don't take orders from people who are afraid of their own shadows. The hesitation on the other end was palpable. I'll talk to the board, the exec finally said. You do that, Clint said, and then he hung up.